I am Jeff LeBlanc, the BA, and I teach leadership here at Bentley and strategy as well as organizational behavior. So a little bit all over the place, which is a good thing, I think, when you're working in business. And I'm coming up on my it will be almost, I hate to say it, but it will be almost 10 years that I've been teaching. And not all at Bentley, but at many different places. And along those places, I met I've seen many faces, I guess I should say. And all of that is what led me to sort of this work. Really, the idea of engaged empathy was really born from my work with Generation Z students. I found myself in a situation, myself as a millennial, I found myself working at a variety of different, for anyone that knows anything about higher education, there's different paths of how you may get involved and sort of begin the process of working in higher ed. And I worked as an adjunct at various different schools, and that's really not all that important. What is important is that I got to meet a lot of different people. And when I met those people, they had a lot to say. And they had a lot of things that I felt were worth examining and worth researching. And so ultimately, that's what led me to this framework. It was the idea that I essentially wanted to look a little bit deeper into what I was hearing, what I was experiencing versus what some people were saying, I guess I should say. And that is sort of what started my interest in Generation Z. And I wrote my dissertation on Generation Z's leadership preferences. And ultimately, some of my work has been featured in Fast Company and Forbes and that, and other, popular publications. But the reality is that the for me, this particular um, model is a real passion project, and I couldn't and wouldn't have continued, I don't think, on this path if it wasn't for how much I really felt, how strongly I felt about it, and how much I really wanted to sort of connect individuals and really bridge. I talk a lot about bridging gaps and bridging generations, and that's really what this led to. So I hope to talk a little bit about that today and share some brief insight. Hopefully, not anything. Like I always say about the work that I do with engaged empathy. I don't think that it's anything that is earth shattering, but it's always interesting when I hear from people and they sort of say, "Well, in some ways, it's refreshing to hear someone sort of talking about these things." And for me, that's a huge win because that means maybe they will talk about these things and maybe they will pass it on. So I'm hoping that maybe we can do that today. So with that being said, I wanted to start. So quick agenda here, and really, again, I sort of already, I think, went into this maybe a little bit more, and so we'll look a little bit about Gen Z because that's really where it started. Look a little bit about the look at the pillars of the model, just a bit. I want to leave you with some practical strategies so you feel like this was a value that's really important to me, and I know to everyone at Bentley, we want to provide that value for you, and maybe a little glimpse at Gen Alpha. What has been, what might be. None of us can say, I guess, for sure, what could be on the horizon. But I also want to say that all of this is started with my research with Gen Z, but ultimately, really, I think applies to everyone, and I hope to sort of address that today. So the first thing that I have here is sort of one thing that some people will have, well, may have mixed feelings on, and it's the idea that I sort of say that Gen Z is not the problem, leadership models are. And that could sound a little confrontational, but it isn't meant to be. It's sort of a headline that sort of gets the people's attention, I would say. But really, what I'm trying to essentially say is that this can be backed up from not only research, but like I mentioned earlier, 10 years of working with primarily Gen Z students has really taught me that, some of the things that are being said or that were being said by people that I was speaking with, business owners, business managers, really weren't aligning with what I was experiencing. And so we can look at the research and we will. We have two stats here, right, that I want to sort of highlight. But I want to say that a lot of this also, and hopefully some of you have had this experience as well, that the Gen Z students and the Gen Z employees are not all that different. And what they're looking for is pretty straightforward, at least from my experience. And again, that's simply my experience. And but the research does help support that. So really, if we look at this, from we I found that 87% of Gen Z employees preferred structured performance reviews, which to me was interesting, and I think really sort of went against what the modern narrative I would say was and even somewhat still is. And ultimately really wanted defined career paths over informal evaluations, which I also think was interesting and not exactly what individuals may have expected. And so if you look at that, a lot of the time, Generation Z is labeled some phrases that some words that come up entitled fragile, disloyal. I think you hear a lot of these for Generation Z. I think you heard a lot of these for millennials as well, but I do think that I don't know if it was quite as perhaps aggressive. At least when I speak to students, I definitely get the sense that they feel that it is somewhat, aggressive is a fair term. Um, and so anyways, so too often, really this is what we call this, I think, this generation. And I would argue that what they're really asking for is transparency, clarity, support, right? Um, so in other words, nothing too groundbreaking, right? Sort of what most of us are looking for. So I saw this as an opportunity to say, I don't think we need to fix Gen Z. I don't think Gen Z is broken. I don't think any generation is broken. I think we need to sort of adapt and move forward and think about what they could benefit from, right? And then how can everyone else benefit from that as well? So that's how this all started, right? And then we move on and we see 85% agreed that empathy improves workplace culture, but said empathy without fairness and structure feels hollow. I found that interesting. As I did my work on my dissertation, it was anyone that knows me knows that I really love talking to people and maybe a little too much. And when one of the things that I got to do, which was the best part of any dissertation, which for me was the best part of the dissertation work, was speaking to Generation Z employees and their employers. And it was fascinating to me because so many times the things that were being said were essentially, I guess you could say, were the same things, but perhaps in a different language. And so, in other words, they were just phrased differently. And it was a lack of communication in some ways, but also a lack of understanding. Two areas I will just say of understanding in terms of lacking. I think Gen Z was a little bit confused as to what they wanted, which I think is anyone at that age, perhaps. So I don't know if that is unique to any one generation. But I think what was really fascinating was their employers really seemed to have a pretty good idea of what they wanted. And I think in some cases, in most cases maybe, they were they were off a little bit. And so that's again, so that sort of led me. I kept finding that kindness, yes, did repeatedly come up, but structure and fairness repeatedly were mentioned, and even on surveys, with some variation of these three, which I think is interesting and makes sense for anyone that's read, about Gen Z in general and just different ways that Gen Z students, if anyone is Gen Z work with Gen Z or has Gen Z children or anything along those lines may see this as well. But to move on, these were some of the stereotypes I was seeing, right? And I can speak hopefully briefly to these areas. And so I was hearing entitled, right? But the reality in my mind and from what I was experiencing daily was a real craving for clarity. And I think sometimes the employers were struggling with the idea that this generation perhaps needed a little bit more of, I don't like to call it hand holding because I don't think that that's a appropriate phrase. I think clarity is a good thing. I think most of us would admit that we like clarity. We like to be clear and know what the rules of the game are. So maybe it was just Gen Z that was finally calling that out, right? So that's what I was seeing. Fragile. I really didn't like that they were calling them fragile. And the reality that I seeing was that they were tired of what I would call passive leadership, right? And many people talk about passive leadership and the idea that, not putting any energy into it. Whatever type of leadership you're following, whatever type of, you know, guidelines you're putting forth, you're really being passive about it and you're not trying to engage at all. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily something new, but I think Gen Z starting to act on it, right? And so, in a lot of ways, leading the way. And lazy was probably the number one thing, and without any explanation, right? They're lazy. And so the way that this one I will admit is a little bit tougher to sort of figure out because there's a couple different ways I think you could take it. But what I was seeing and sort of the connections I made was that it was more so that they wanted, some sort of structure in terms of what, not only like I mentioned the rules of the game, but what it was that we wanted that was supposed to be happening, right? The idea of having someone come into the office and sort of, you know, just, I guess you could say, self lead or just sort of figure it out as they go is fine in theory in some ways, but I think that's where you lead to some of that miscommunication, right? And so having some of that structure in place can benefit all of us, right? And the transparency, of course, is sort of, where I stand in terms of will I get a promotion? Will I get a raise after a certain amount of time? All these different things that, can be made fairly clear. And it doesn't mean that it will make everyone happy, but at least people will know, right? So that's sort of where I was at. And so moving forward, what's really going on? So, and this is really where I started to explore it in terms of, and some of these things even surprised me. All right. So, in terms of, the attention that they sort of got. And so for here, one of the buzzwords, we all know quiet quitting, and Generation Z was being sort of linked to quiet quitting. But the truth is really, and so I was asked to sort of speak a little bit on that just because I had, studied Gen Z, but quiet quitting is something that is any generation of someone of any age can certainly I mean, people were quiet quitting before quiet quitting was a thing, right? I mean, so it's certainly not new. And so ultimately, what I drew from when I worked on a piece for a Fast Company was the idea that it was really the outdated leadership that they were really rejecting. It wasn't that they were quiet quitting. Again, that lack of communication, the idea that if there's unclear outcomes, right? If we don't really know um, what is going to pay off in the end, or what's going to be what they consider to be fair, or what is what clarity can be provided. If that isn't happening, then ultimately you do some. I think anyone would sort of perhaps be frustrated. So I think it was Gen Z sort of leading the way again. Um, what I would not call it laziness. I have here, I really think it was a refusal to overextend without purpose, really drawing those boundaries, which I think is in a lot of ways admirable. and I think a lot of people are coming around to that. Then, quite to my surprise, Forbes looked at the idea, which I thought was brilliant, that the FMLA Act, essentially, and FMLA in general, was being used in a lot of ways by Gen Z. And they sort of talked about the engaged empathy leadership model as a way to sort of tackle that, right? And the idea was that this, generation is, in this case, the article made the case that, they're using the policies that are available. And it's not necessarily a red flag, it may be a wake up call, right? And again, back to the idea that Gen Z sort of leading the way, more and more people doing this. The stats were showing that Gen Z was doing this, and perhaps is doing this in higher numbers, but nevertheless, maybe less of a red flag, more of a wake up call. So I thought that was quite interesting. And then purpose driven work, I think, less about perks, more about meaning, impact, value. I don't think that this is unique to, again, to Gen Z, but I think that what is unique to Gen Z is the idea of really speaking up about that, perhaps along with millennials as well, and encouraging others to. So I thought that was, quite interesting. And so that's where, I sort of got this idea that empathy without action is really just a feeling. I'm thinking, leadership really requires movement. So we can have, you know, this idea that essentially, that people, a lot of employers, at least that I've talked to, really do think that they are being, in a lot of ways, are being um, kind and are being what I would call surface level nice, right? And and they think that that should be enough, and perhaps it has been. But what was happening, I think, is that Gen Z was sort of, they're very savvy, right? And sort of noticing the differences, or maybe just speaking up about the differences. But I think many of us, no matter what generation we are, can relate to some of these things. So for me, these were some examples that I had that I think that, you know, really are empathy versus what I would call engaged empathy. And we don't have to go through each one of them. But one of the things I always say is that, empathy is sort of, if you think of a rainstorm, right, and you are out, standing out, and standing in the rain, and I feel like empathy, um, or niceness, however you want to put it, kindness, is giving someone an umbrella. But engaged empathy is giving them the umbrella and staying with them, and keeping them company, and really sort of engaging with figuring out sort of maybe what happened, right? And not that I'm recommending giving umbrellas to strangers on the side of the street. I'm just saying that's sort of a way to look at it. But really active engagement. And so there's a few examples in here, and that I'll look at forward. So one of the things, and I did come prepared, because sometimes I'll have people say, well, this sounds great, the idea of engaged empathy, but how's it different? How is this different from what already exists? So the way I see it is servant leadership and transformational leadership are the two that I say are probably my biggest influences. I would say this is sort of a middle ground of the two, right? And servant leadership is, I think, really beautiful in its intent. I think it's fantastic. The idea of really putting the team's needs first, really building a community, leading with heart, right? All these things I think are fantastic. But the problem is, I think sometimes with servant leadership, you sort of, and I've many of us have probably seen this happen. We sort of see people lose direction, right? And sort of ultimately, because we're working so much as a team, as a group, we sort of lose the sense of, direction and structure that we may need. And with transformational leadership, again, it's all about vision, which is great, right? Inspiring change, it energizes people. It's fantastic. big ideas. But I think sometimes the individual needs of people can sometimes be overlooked. Not in a bad way. It's not intentional, but when you're so focused on the overall vision, right, of the organization and everyone in general, I feel like you can sometimes miss that individual connection. So that's why I think engaged empathy sort of finds that middle ground. It's the idea that we want to it's not passive. It's certainly not passive. And in a lot of ways, it is thinking big picture, right? But it's grounded and a little more grounded, perhaps, than transformational. And looking at, the idea of that we're going to show up, we're going to engage with care, but we're also going to be very clear, right? We're going to pay attention to the individual. We're going to lead with heart, but we're also going to lead with standards, right? And we're going to make sure that, we are delivering the appropriate level of work that we need to do. And we can do that by, being kind to each other and empathetic towards each other, but also providing that very clear sort of roadmap, right? And that the idea that the fairness in the structure can come in. So I don't think it's a replacement for anything. I think it's the idea that we're refining it, right? We're refining and just moving forward. I don't think it's the answer to everything, but I think that there are ways that we could definitely benefit, right, from those three particular pillars, which I'm going to jump into in a second, and hopefully ask for some thoughts and ideas from everyone. So the three pillars, just to sort of catch us all up. So again, started with Gen Z, started the research, right? Started finding these three areas that repeatedly were coming up, and realized, in my opinion, that this was perhaps, if Gen Z was the catalyst, there was still plenty of individuals and forward and maybe even coming, you know, older generations as well that could benefit from this. And so again, I start with kindness. I'm a firm believer in kindness. I think most people are, but I think sometimes when we refer to kindness, we think of the term nice. And I think there's quite a big difference between being nice and being kind. I'm going to be writing more about this. Well, I have an anecdote that in an upcoming book on this topic. And essentially, I talk a lot about, to keep it professional, the nicest jerk that I had ever met. And essentially, that story, although I might not use the word jerk, and essentially that looks at the idea that this person was successful in a lot of ways. And he was very, very nice. Everybody wanted to, speak to him, and he would show up to different things or whatever it may be. But there was something lacking, and many people would see through it. They would see through the idea that it was almost surface level. So very pleasant to be around, which was great, but ultimately lacking that connection, right? And not that everyone needs to be best friends in the workplace, but even just little things like remembering someone's work anniversary or something little. Those things were non-existent to him, and so to me that was the difference between sort of service level niceness, or someone even mentioning I witnessed instances, not to go too much, but instances of sort of him speaking over with people on a Friday about what was coming up that weekend. Maybe it was something major, maybe it was one of their children was doing something at school or whatever it may be, and then sort of forgetting that they even had that conversation come Monday. And things happen, nobody's perfect, but to me that was like this is surface level, right? And maybe we can go further with this. And then structure, which of course is, the answer to chaos. So many people, I think, feel like chaos is everywhere. And I think Gen Z, especially, really is giving permission to say, let's try to create some clarity, especially because they're the future, and we sort of want to make sure that there's some of that, but it doesn't have to be rigid. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be strict. We can just remove some of the guesswork, which I think, again, another topic, but I think that some of that sort of, I guess you could say, laissez-faire or whatever terms you want to use, was more embraced with millennials, at least based on studies. And I don't know if Gen Z so much loves that. And fairness, right? I think that's what makes people stay. I think the idea of knowing what, giving opportunities, right? Equity and consistency, giving people opportunities, but also being straightforward with people. I worked with a manager once who, pretty much straight out said seniority is our biggest priority in terms of what we consider an advancement. Okay, then let people know that, right? Why not? Let people know that that is what's going to be of value. And then that way there's no guesswork. And that way we know, right? We know, and employees know. You say Gen Z's lazy. Well, they might not be if they know that if they can work, if they work, under certain guidelines, and know that eventually that could lead to the promotions if they're there long enough, or if you promote via, work performance versus seniority, whatever it may be, you certainly can put that out there. So that's sort of where that started. And so what I wanted to ask someone, and maybe even because I want to come back to this, maybe even one volunteer, because I know we're coming up on the Q&A time, but I just wanted to ask, sort of out of the three, kindness, structure, and fairness, I was curious if anyone, without going into, before I go into a few more details, and then I was going to ask this again, but even if we just ask it once and then move on, sort of, do you think that there's one area that you, as a leader or someone who you work under, or whoever it may be, or your environment, whatever it may be, do you think that there's one in particular area that you could, maybe, you know, work on a little bit, and that might sort of move the needle and improve starting today or starting Tuesday, like Emma said? If anybody has any. No?
And feel free to use the Q&A if you want to add something there or add to the chat.
In my team, I'd vote for structure. All right. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a big one that a lot of people say, right? The idea that, and I talk to a lot of people that, mention that, I will say that, I've been fortunate to be able to work with, everyone from, you know, talk to people from white collar jobs to blue collar, you name it. And kindness does become an issue, but I do think that a lot of companies manage that a lot better, right? But I love the idea that people are responding to the structure, right? The idea, especially with remote work, right? And I do go on. I will spend a little bit more time on that, not today, but sort of how this could appeal, um, future writing, to, and then how this could be worked out in remote situations, which I think could be helpful. So if we can hold off and talk a few of these things, and then if you have anything, when we get to the Q&A, that would be perfect, right? So leading with kindness, structure, and fairness, what it looks like and what's missing. So I think I wanted to just give a few examples here, sort of in practice and sort of what's missing. And I was going to give you some examples from my work. So with kindness, like I said, kindness, I think most of us sort of see the difference, hopefully, between nicest and kindness. But I have to say, one of the more interesting things was, I come from a blue collar background, and So one of the things that I wanted to do is I did not want to do this research without involving blue collar workers, right? And so this could be a stereotype, but I remember working with a man who owned a, trades company, and he had a lot of young employees. And one of the things that was repeatedly brought up was that he felt that if he was too kind, that he wouldn't be respected. He felt that if he, was too friendly, that he would be seen as weak. These sorts of things. And we had a conversation and so on and so on. But ultimately, what ended up happening was he was able, and it was really impacting. It was impacting his work because he was losing a lot of employees. A lot of employees were moving on, which was an unfortunate for him. And so ultimately, what would happen is, he says, I can't connect with them. I don't, And I said, well, here's an idea. What if you kept sort of like a not in a strange way, right? But what if you kept sort of like you keep logs of everything else. I said, what if you kept a log, of something, and it's sort of like a notebook or a Word doc or whatever it may be, where you just sort of kept track of things that people might, like, so, uh, someone might have a certain preference for music, or someone's birthday is this or that. And he did that, and it was little things, and he never told anybody. It wasn't something that everybody knew. He was taking notes or things like that, but he was able to sort of make kindness work for him, which I feel was really interesting, right? Um, and so that was one example. And I know that we're coming up on time, so I'm going to try to go through these quickly. But um, structure, of course, clear goals, right? And so for one of the examples I give is in my classroom. I've noticed over the years one of the biggest factors really becomes the issue of reminding students, right? Frequently sort of being very clear with what the structure is, being upfront about what to expect in the class. And that sort of thing, I think, translates very well to the workplace. It eliminates some frustration, right? It can really help with the quiet quitting situation, because I think when people in general feel frustrated, then they certainly will disengage. And fairness, of course, I spoke a little bit about already, so I think we sort of know. But one person I remember, I specifically spoke with a Gen Z student who felt that they worked so difficult. They were a student, and then I interviewed them as an employee, and they put in their work was so difficult, and they put in so much time, and they felt like um, at the end of the year, at the fiscal year, there were raises, but there was no sort of explanation. And he basically was not, even though he was a high performer, he was not given any. Not only was he not given a raise, but he wasn't given any explanation why. And ultimately, he moved on, right, and left and went to another position. And again, retention, right? I think we could avoid that if we have a little bit of that, because he felt it was unfair, right? That he wasn't being told it, and who can't relate to that, right? So again, this just looks at, and I mean, for time's sake, we don't have to go through with these slides. I believe are going to be shared, but it looks at all the different generations. Going back from baby boomers. I don't like to use the term boomers. I think it's sort of disrespectful, and I think that it sort of encourages the sort of generation wars. So I like to call them baby boomers, give them a little bit more, um, you know, uh, respect in that sense. But you can look at sort of the generalization and how I think engaged empathy could help, right? Generation X as well, millennials, Gen Z, maybe just look at one. For example, Gen X tends to be seen as a sort of forgotten generation in a lot of ways, which I don't know why, because they make up a huge portion of the workforce. Very independent, typically skeptical of authority, sort of, that 90s vibe. And so, really, I think that this could create clarity without micromanagement. And I think Gen X would really respond to that. And they do respond to that, I think. And again, these are generalizations, and everyone's individual, but I think something to think about, right? So again, we could go through each one of these, but for time's sake, I do just want to sort of move forward. But like I said, the slides will be shared. Um, and so again, a bridge, not a boundary. So, here are some, there's this sort of narrative around every generation needs something completely different, right? And sure, there are definitely differences in style, but when you strip it down, the core needs are really consistent. So, a recent study found that 70% of employees feel more loyal to leaders who treat them fairly. That's not just Gen Z, that's everyone. So that's pretty, I mean, again, to me, common sense, but it's interesting to hear um, that that's a surprise to some people, right? And there are some who say older generations don't care about emotional intelligence and kindness. I'm not sure that's true either, because there's a recent poll that says that 80% of workers over 45 said that kindness from their manager really absolutely affected how they're not only their job satisfaction but their performance, which I thought was interesting. And one more for you: 78% of employees across generations say they would like more clarity and in structure. They would really prefer that, right? And have that. So, again, the idea really could be that this is not just, it was, like I said, Gen Z may have got me thinking and other people, I think, thinking about it, but really it's for everyone. And we never want to make a generation feel like, I've never, quickly, I'll just say, one of the things that I am so passionate about making clear is that I never want any generation or any person in general in the workforce to feel that they don't belong. Right? That's the absolute opposite of what this is about and what I really try to say. Right? The idea is that we are going to have a workforce with, Bentley just released a wonderful article in Bentley University Magazine, and sort of looking at the 6 generations that are going to be in the workforce. And, everyone has a place, and everyone can bring so many different things in so many different ways that we can learn from each other. And so that's what this is about. It's about, and you may have done this as when you started work, and maybe that wasn't great for you either. So let's do things this way, because perhaps this is how we can sort of evolve and be better in general, right? And I think that that's really helpful. Um, so what can you do starting Monday or Tuesday? So a couple things. I think quickly, a clarity check-in. I think on your next one-on-one, I talk a lot about how the difference, how to make one-on-ones more personal, right? Do you feel clear on what success looks like? Right? Is there a lack? One of the biggest things, lack of structure. Like I mentioned, my students perform, much better when rubrics are clear, feedback is timely, right? I'm not waiting to give feedback on an assignment on 2 months later, where they've already moved way beyond it. I'm providing feedback within maybe a week or two at the most, so that way it's right and fresh in their minds, right? And the same in the workplace. Fairness audit, which is something I talk about, which is really looking at, taking a quick look at, your recognitions, your stretch assignments, raises, everything, how you've sort of distributed over the past year, and if you think that fairness has been a priority for you, and if whether or not, and you have to make those decisions, but ultimately that's where quiet quitting can come in when fairness is, not felt. And kindness, I have this little, again, like I said, this small notebook idea. Birthdays, work anniversaries, I've recommended. Even that was one of the man that I spoke to. He remembered that one of his employees was a massive Celtics fan, which he's probably not feeling so great right now. But ultimately, he remembered that, right? He wrote it down, and he said it felt weird at first to write, Matt or whatever his name was, Celtics, in a book. But he wasn't naturally good at remembering those things, and that's okay. So he just would write that down, and then he would take a look at it, and I don't know. I thought it was great, and there was a lot of good response there. So that was, I would think, really helpful. And so the last thing here before the Q&A is just looking forward to Gen Alpha, who's coming up, and ultimately they are, we don't know a lot yet. I'm very excited to do some work in this area. But we know a few things, right? We know that Gen Alpha is not, AI is not new to them. We know that is going to be very, very clear. We know that thankfully, mental health is really going to be the idea of addressing mental health is going to be even more normalized than with Gen Z, which we didn't even get to today, but I think sort of goes without saying. So that's fantastic. We also know that it's very likely, based on a lot of different things that with, during a pandemic and all sorts of things, that they are going to want feedback and they're going to want it now. So sort of going back to that structure idea, because we know, and many of us that teach or work with Gen Z, we know and work with younger students, some of you may have young kids, that the attention span almost non-existent. And good or bad, we can work with it, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. So I think really Gen Z opened the door to a lot of these things. And other generations, I think, are going to follow. And again, I think that feedback, the flexible learning, purpose driven, all these things are going to continue. But I really think that because of so much of the uncertainty and chaos that sort of surrounds so many of us, that I do think that the idea of the structure and the clarity is going to be a key factor moving forward because it seems to be more and more in demand. And I think people of all ages are really speaking up and saying, yes, like I just need some of that. And maybe Gen Z opened the door for us to be able to say, we need this. So, okay, so that's, I guess, sort of my blurb. So if
Steph,
any,
this is spectacular. There actually is a question that I would say stems directly from kind of where you ended that I would love us to focus on first, which is the participant says, it feels like there's a taboo around asking for more kindness or fairness in the workplace because that might imply that the workplace is somehow lacking and leaders might not like that you're pointing that out, which goes back to kind of what you shared as the perceptions of Gen Z or perceptions of folks asking for this. So the question is, how do you engage leadership with these ideas without hurting feelings or creating a bad reputation for yourself?
and that's a fantastic question. I think, especially with I think one, we can lead with kindness ourselves. But I think that, one of which is a huge, factor. But I do think that one of the things in terms of, I think it really, hopefully, the more that we spread this message, I would hope that the workplace, especially around structure and fairness, I would hope that, the idea that you could go to whoever it may be, human resources is a great, obviously starting point, and sort of, address these issues. But I just want to focus on the kindness aspect because I think you're right. I think some people may feel like they are, being kind, where perhaps again, and they are in their own way, but maybe you do need more, and that's fair, right? So I think that one of the things is to not only lead by example, right? I think I remember I worked somewhere once and I sort of noticed that people were, I don't know, feeling just a little down with things that were going on. It was a school and not Bentley, and so I sort of organized a holiday gift exchange, and I felt that the idea and the it had never. I remember speaking to my supervisor at the time, and he said that the idea had never even really dawned on him because he thought that it wasn't really something you could do because of course he wanted to keep everybody's different perspectives and different celebrations in order. And like I said, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with just giving each other gifts, right? And celebrating each other, right? And that's something that and that seems okay. And that's something that we did. So I think that obviously I don't want to just say you want to run into your boss's office and say, be nicer to me. That probably won't work so well. But I think if we can lead ourselves and lead, work around, how we treat others, maybe it'll it'll be recognized. And I talk about in my book and in other work that I think that leaders really need to acknowledge this and have more open sort of town halls where it's safe and acceptable to ask these questions and there's no fear of retaliation because there's no room for that in the current workplace.
Jeff, I have another question for you that's kind of similar, which is around you had on your kind of do this on Monday or Tuesday slide, this idea of a clarity check-in. So if you're a manager, say opening up this conversation of, have I given you enough clarity of what success looks like? I'm curious on the receiving end of that, is there any expectation of preparation for a conversation like that? Does that actually show even more empathy to say, hey, I want to talk about this, want to give you preparation for that so that you can fully engage without fear, as you're saying, of retaliation or kind of being put on the spot? Like, help us understand as managers how to bring that kind of kindness and clarity that will be best received by those that we work with.
Right. And so what I've seen for sure is that with when I've, interviewed employers and sort of work consulted a little bit with different managers, one of the things that I always say is that you never want to obviously naturally spring this on someone. You want to take the time to let them prepare as well. But you also, I think one thing that I mentioned, especially with younger employees, but I think it applies to everyone, is the idea that, it can make us nervous, right? I want, if you all of a sudden as a manager, I'm calling people in. So for me, I think it needs to be, something that we're doing. One of the things I talk about, and not everyone's comfortable with it, but is sort of taking, and I interviewed a manager once, and she used to go, and I don't even know if this is, I think I saw no issue with it. She asked one of her employees, she wanted to get sort of to the bottom of this. And I said, well, what could you do? And she said, well, we both really like to, they both had kids, they had a lot in common. They said, we're going to go, take a run to the store, go to Costco or something. And I said, well, ask her to go. I said, why not? I said, why couldn't you just go and, have a conversation about it? And she said that they did. They went, they had a conversation, they talked, she brought up, obviously, I think this, she was very comfortable sort of talking in a way that made people feel comfortable, which was helpful. But that was one example that I thought was so interesting, yeah, just take a Costco run and just talk a little bit about it. But also, maybe making it something that, putting it on you, saying, look, nobody here is going to face, this is not something that's about you as something you're doing wrong. This is about me, right? This is about me as a leader. I really want to improve and I want to be better and owning it.
I love that. Jeff, let's do one more question, and then I know we have to close out, which is devastating. But fortunately, just for those on the line, we are going to share a way for you to get Jeff's slides and to see all this material. And Jeff very kindly, spoiler alert, is going to share ways to continue to connect with him. But the last question I will include is someone asks, how can you inspire leadership to include accountability in their practice, kind of your engaged piece of engaged empathy? They tell a great story about, well, actually a very sad story, but they tell a telling story about a time that someone showed empathy without engagement that led to folks leaving a company. How do you inspire someone to carry that accountability?
Well, I think that's sort of answers what I have seen the most. One of the biggest, I get pushback. Believe me, plenty of pushback on these ideas from individuals, and I love it because it's great conversation, and it means that they're actually willing. And one of the things I always say is, well, hey, if you want proof, I can give you proof, right? Engagement and retention, and that's one of the biggest factors. And so I think, how I'm not going to necessarily speak about how you might go about reinforcing that, right? And saying again, I think maybe human resources could be involved, maybe an outside party, different ways to sort of, mediate or to do that. But I think that a leader, someone who's a leader should, if these people are, and I can't wait to read through these, the example a little closer in the chat, but I think if you're losing your employees, and that's what was happening in the example I gave, that's proof enough, right? That's evidence enough that look, something's not working. And so that's one way. And again, I think being straightforward, I think hopefully if we can be more comfortable with our employers, and if our employers can just, that's why I'm trying to get this message out there, right? And that's why more and more people are sharing this message. If you're losing your employees, something's wrong. And surface level niceness, it's great. It's like if I have a flat tire on the side of the road, smiling at me and waving while you go by, I appreciate it. But what I really need is for you to help me change my tire, right? That's what I really need. And if you're not doing that, then I may find someone who is going to do that for me.
Thank you so much, Jeff.